Hello and welcome to Computer Tech and More. Today I've got a great roundup for you. We're going to be taking a look at the Noctua NF-P14s Redux, the Noctua NF-A14, and the Noctua Industrial NF-A14. I think I repeated myself twice there. This one will go to 3,000 RPM. They make a 2,000 RPM as well. And I think they have one more down. I don't recall what it is. This one will do 1,500, and this is 1,500 as well. And we're going to see how they do in this 140 millimeter Noctua roundup. Let's get right into testing, and then we're going to take a look at the boxes for each of the fans and go into some of the features visually looking at the fans themselves. All right, let's get right into it. The Noctua NF-P14s Redux, the NF-A14, and the NF-A14 PPC Industrial 3000 RPM fan. Let's go over some basic specs about them before we get into the graphs. So all three of them are 140 millimeter fans to keep things consistent in this roundup. The bearing type in the P14s is the SSO. The A14 uses the SO2, and the PPC A14 uses the SSO2 as well. RPM, the P14 is 1,500 RPM. The A14 is 1,500 as well. The A14 PPC 3000, as the name indicates, has a maximum RPM of 3,000 RPM. So it is double the other two fans. Minimum RPM of the P14 is 450, the A14 at 300, and the PPC 3000 at 800. So you're getting up a little bit at the bottom end in that 3,000 RPM fan to get the top end. So it means it won't be as quiet likely as the other ones at the absolute minimums, but around the 800 mark should probably be similar. We'll see it in the graphs. Okay, moving on. The airflow rating for the 14S is 133.7 meters cubed per hour. The A14 is 140.2, again, meters cubed per hour. And the A14 3000 is 269.3 meters cubed per hour. So it's pretty much double the other ones. Acoustic performance for the P14 is 25.8, A14 24.6, and the 3000 RPM one at 41.3. That makes a lot of sense because it's spinning faster, so more noise. Static pressure for the P14 is 1.91. The A14 is 2.08, and the A14 3000 is at 6.58. So if you really need to be able to push through a lot of stuff, the 3000 RPM fan is probably the one for you. But let's go ahead and get into the graphs. Before we get into the graphs and data, I want to show you my raw data. If you would like to use it for your own analysis, here it is. If you would like to feature it in your own video, I just ask that you reference me as the creator of this data because I spent a long time creating the data. But here's the A14 3000, here's the A14, and here is the P14S. If you want data for the other fans, you need to check out my other videos. All right, let's get into the graphs. Here we are. The first couple graphs are going to be airflow in my case simulation of distance, which is the bottom axis, the x-axis, from the fan versus the airspeed. So in a perfect world, you would never see the airspeed drop across as you get further away from the fan. But we are not in the real world, or we are in the real world. We're not in a imaginary made-up world. What am I saying? Anyways, so since we have nothing to actually compare against, we're going to just look at it pretty quickly. The fact that the A14 is pretty linear, but that is also pretty close to 100% PWM. But it's very flat at, what was that, 685 RPM. So that's really good. But a larger fan is going to do a little bit better in this sort of test than a smaller fan. And you want the fan to have and the better, more focused the airflow is out of the fan, the better it will do in these testing. And the A14 3000 is probably going to do the best of all because it has the highest RPM. Let's go ahead and move to the next graph, move along quickly. This first graph here is RPM versus airspeed, the vertical axis being RPM and the horizontal axis being airspeed. The red dots represent the average fan in my testing. The light blue here represents the A14 3000. The green dots represent the P14 and the dark blue represents the A14. And this test is through the air cooler. And again, this is air speed, not the temperature, because there will come a point where you're moving air so fast through the air cooler that you actually won't get any more heat out of it. You would need an insane heat load on something, and then your computer would probably thermal throttle long before that to justify like insanely high RPMs. You would need just a really high heat load, and you probably won't be getting it on this sort of cooler. Anyways, there's my disclosure on that. Anywho, so what do we see from these graphs? Well, they all pretty much line up, which indicates that the blade performance, because RPM versus airspeed are very similar to each other. So they are all very efficient, or almost nearly efficient, in terms of their blade design to be able to push air through the cooler. And they are all below the average fan, which is actually good because it shows a higher efficiency in the fan itself. Basically, that means that the fan doesn't need to spin as fast to achieve the same amount of airflow, thus a more efficient blade design. This next graph is RPM versus CFM. So this is basically the air going through my duct to see how much air it can push through, and I did a conversion factor to go from meters per second to cubic feet per minute. Yes, I applied it correctly. If you want, I can show you it on the graphs, and if you're really questioning it, I'll make a short about it in a video. But I applied the conversion factor to get cubic feet per minute. Right here we have the average fan is the red line, the dark blue is the A14 regular, the green line is the P14, and the light blue is the A14 3000 RPM fan. And we can see that there are some slight differences between the regular A14 and the A14 3000. Not sure why there's that difference, but that's the way the air flowed. Moving on to the next graph, which takes as noise versus CFM, with the y-axis being noise, the horizontal axis being CFM. And again, with this one, lower is better. You want the fan to produce less noise for the same amount of CFM. Here we find that the regular A14 just kind of produces a little bit more noise than the average fan. I don't specifically know why, because the 3000 RPM one and the regular A14 have the exact same blade design, but it could just be something different with the bearing or something like that, that it just ended up making slightly more noise. But that's what I found for my testing. I imagine if I bought 100 different about 100 A14s, 100 A14 3000s, and did a computational average of it, they would more or less equal out on each other. So I could have just gotten a particularly noisy version of it. But that being said, it does slightly underperform compared to the average 140 millimeter fan. The P14s appears to do actually particularly well. It more or less follows the same trend as the A14 3000, which is what I think the normal A14 would actually be. And it actually does a little bit better at the very top end, which I find pretty impressive. So again, with this graph, being under the average fan indicates a better performance in the blade design, because you're pushing more air for the same RPM. So if you're looking at like 100 CFM, how fast does the blade need to spin? Right there, it's spinning slower than the average fan, which indicates it should also be quieter. The next graph we're looking at is noise versus RPM. So again, this sort of graph is how efficient are the fans at, or how quiet the blades are at particular RPMs. Lower is better. And more or less what we find here is that the P14 and the A14 3000 basically are right on, like pretty much follow the exact average fan 100%. At the bottom end, they outperform it a little bit, but I would discount that. I would say that's within error. The regular A14, I think something was up with the bearing and it just produced a little bit of extra noise. But overall, they're average fans for their RPM. They are better than average for their CFM. This next graph is noise normalized distance from the fan versus an air speed. So again, this is just like my first graphs, except this one is only using the noise normalized data. The red line here is the average fan. The green line is the P14s redux. The darker blue line is the A14 regular. And the light blue line is the 3000 RPM one. So the A14 3000 was spinning at 883 RPM. The P14 was 725 and the regular A14 was at 665. So the higher RPM of the 3000 is why it's a top performer here. So again, there could be just some slight differences in the rotors for the PPC versus the regular ones, which make it slightly quieter so that it can operate more or less noiselessly at that little bit higher, 200 RPM higher speed, basically. And how do they compare against the average fan? Well, they all outperform it. Here, higher is better, as the vertical axis is airspeed, and you want the airspeed to be as high as possible throughout the entire distance. One note here is that the P14s appears to not do as good a job at focusing the airflow as the A14s. Basically, the A14s trend very similarly, pretty differently than the P14. So the P14 may be great on a air cooler or like a bottom intake fan, or pushing air through a radiator, something like that, but probably not as good in an airflow focused case, or to get air from the front to the back in a more focused type manner. Next up, we have the exact same graph analysis, except at 100% PWM. And here, the obvious winner is going to be the 3000 RPM fan. It just blows the other fans out of the water because it can spin the fastest, basically. And it achieved 2,950 RPM. I should note that fan RPMs, that is within like average for the fan. They can go plus or minus like 10%, 5% of whatever the rated RPMs are. Normally that's like plus or minus like 20 or 30. So that's 30 under, 30 over. Anyways, moving on. And then same color lines. The average fan is red. The A14 regular was spinning at 1,490 and had a decibel rating of 57. The P14s redux was spinning at 1,540 at 53 decibels. The 3000 RPM A14 was, already said that, and at 62.5 decibels. So it was significantly out. The decibel range is not linear. It is, logarithmic, I think. And either way, like each decibel value is like double the previous one. So it adds up really quickly. Stating the obvious again, the 3000 RPM fan clearly is the fastest. The A14 finally gets to stretch its legs and does quite a bit better than the P14. The P14, it basically sits at an average fan. And that average fan includes both 120 millimeters and 140 millimeter fans, as they are all done in the exact same testing apparatus. Noctua NF-P14s Redux on the air cooler testing. This will give the general idea and trends that you'll see on radiators as well, though not exactly equivalent, but the trends. In this graph, we're looking at noise normalized airspeed through my air cooler. So this gives us general trends in more air pressure optimized fans. I don't have a radiator at this point to test out my fans that way, but the trends you see here apply towards radiators, but won't be exactly the same. Some of these fans may do significantly better on a more restrictive airflow than other ones, but it gives you a general idea. So ones that are towards the top of this graph will likely do better than the ones towards the bottom in pressure optimized cases. Anyways, with that said, these are all directly comparable. Up at the top, we have my average composite fan. As I do more testing, the average fan will move because it'll change my average. And in other graphs for CFM, I have an average 140 and an average 120. We'll get into that later. So at the very top of this graph, we have the NF-A14 3000 RPM fan, which has a minimum RPM of 883 and achieved 1.1 meters per second of airflow. The Silent Wings 4 Pro 120 right behind it. The P14s achieving a very respectable 0.9, and the A14 achieving 0.86, I'm sorry, with the P14s achieving 0.95, which is why it does outperform the other fan. But you can see that size does matter. In this case, the 140s tend to do a little bit better than the 120s, with the A12X25 actually performing pretty darn well. Now that we've done noise normalized, let's take a look at the fans at 100% PWM airspeed. And at the very top, no surprise, we have the 3000 RPM A14, which is spinning at 2,950 RPM and had a noise level of 62.5 decibels, achieving 3.2 meters per second of airflow. The Silent Wings 4 Pro 120. Next up, with the 140 behind that, then we have the P14s Redux spinning at 1,540 and 53 decibels by my noise readings. Please see my testing methodology piece for how the noise levels were generated. Then we have the A14 next behind that, achieving 1.75 meters per second of airflow, and the NF-A12X25 next up. So basically all those fans would do great as an air cooler at this point, but at 100% RPM, something has gone very wrong and your computer needs to flush out heat. And then for kicks and giggles, this is noise normalized distance from the fan versus airspeed. So this is in my case simulation apparatus. And you can see where the top performers are. This is the A14 3000. It is the best, with the Silent Wings 4 Pro kind of right there with it at the top, and then it drops down much more quickly. The other ones are a little bit harder to read in there. If you want to take the time and decipher this, you can go ahead, or you can check out the other videos, take down the data, do it yourself. But here it is. All right, and next up for the kick and giggles graphs, we have the 100% PWM distance versus airspeed, and once again at the top, we have the 3000 RPM A14. It's just gonna be hands down the best. And the number 2 spot, we have the Pro 4 140. Again, larger diameter fans tend to do a little bit better in this test, although the 120 does really well. And the X2 GP18, which is in the torrent case, also does particularly well because it is such a large fan. And well, there it is. The bottom performers over here are the NF-S12A. This graph right here is noise normalized airspeed at a distance of 9 inches. I decided to make 9 inches the benchmark for this because it seems sort of like a good middle ground between well, a short case and a long case for the air to have to push through it. And the 3000 RPM A14 is the top performer, achieving an airspeed of 1.5 meters per second. The GP14 was at 1.3. It's averaged a little bit higher than that. My anemometer accuracy is to the 0.1 meter per second. So effectively, the GP14 and SilenWings 4 Pros would be very similar. The A14 is still very respectable towards the top of the graph here in this brown line, with the P14s Redux trailing the other ones, but still at a very respectable air velocity because it outperforms most of the 120s. Now, at 100% PWM curve, the airspeed at 9 inches, the 3000 RPM A14, just hands down going to be the best because it can spin the fastest and push the most air, pushing 4.5 meters per second. That's how fast the airspeed was at the end. The SilenWings 4 Pro, spinning at 2,436 RPM and 61.5 decibels, only pushed 3.1 meters per second of air in terms of air velocity. The A14 regular, right here in this brown, achieved an airspeed of 2.25, with the P14 trailing quite a bit in this blue line at the same 1,540, close enough to the same RPM of 1.7, which indicates that it disperses the air more. It doesn't focus it as well as the A14. Okay. In this graph, we're taking a look at noise normalized CFM. So this is taking the air velocity and then converting it to the surface area that it's pushing through. And the 140 millimeter fans are not directly comparable to the 120s, even though they are on the same graph. I just don't have enough data for the 140s yet, so they aren't on their own graph. But basically everything over the gray 140 line, you can take as one data set, and everything below the average darker gray 120 is a different data set. We're going to be focusing on the top because we're looking at 140 millimeter fans here. In noise normalized testing for CFM, cubic feet per minute, and before anybody complains, yes, I applied conversion factors for meters per second to cubic feet per minute. I am well aware they are different units of measure. Feet and meters are different. Anyways, the A14 3000 was the top performer, spinning at 883 RPM and achieved a CFM of 77.3. The NF-P14s Redux had an RPM of 725.9 and was moving 73.3 cubic feet per minute of air. SilenWings 4 Pro comes next with the NF-A14 spinning at 665 and moving 58.8. So again, a very respectable result, but a little bit behind the average 140 millimeter fan. And again, I want to note that my average fan will move over time as I test more fans. Checking things out at 100% PWM for the CFM, it is no surprise that the A14 3000 is the very top of the chart, actually by a huge amount, pushing 226 cubic feet per minute of air. And the RPMs and decibel ratings are there as well for you to read. They're the last two numbers. The SilenWings 4 Pro comes in next, with the P14s coming in third place, and the A14 regular trailing behind actually pretty significantly, which I find a little bit surprising considering the similar blade design, which does indicate that the P14s is a more efficient blade design. One more of my graphs that's basically for kicks and giggles because it's really hard to read everything on it. This is fan noise versus RPM, as opposed to like CFM or something else. So this is basically how efficient noise-wise the blade is. And very worst right here is the GPS X2GP18, which is the fan actually inside the touring case, the 180mm fans. And up here we have the NF-S12A. At the bottom here we have the Silent Wings 4 Pro 120s. And basically the fans that I tested in this kind of just get washed out into the middle. Can't really spot them easily. I would say, yeah, here is the 3000 RPM fan. So just note that if you buy any of the fans basically in this review that I've just been talking about, they're more or less average. They're good fans. Noctua NF-P14s Redux. Noctua NF-A14. Noctua NF-A14 Industrial IPC 3000 RPM fan. So we finished all the testing and taking a look at all the data. Let's take a look at some of the packaging for these three different fans. So first up we have the NF-A14, and this is one of the original main Noctua fans. It's a 140mm fan, and it features their SSO2 bearing. And well, here's the packaging, and they talk about the different features of the fan blades and how it's supposed to help with guiding airflow through it, the bearing, the SSO2, and the stepped inlet. Of course, here's the fan and the packaging and everything it comes with. And here's what's inside the box. So what do you get? You get a extension cable, a Y splitter, the low noise adapter, a couple little screws, these, what are they called, like rubber grommets they can use to install the fan. And of course you have the case fan. We're going to get into comparing the case fans here in a second. Next, let's take a look at the Redux. The Redux has its basic packaging. It has the basic features of the fan. This has the SSO original bearing as opposed to the SSO2. And inside you just have the fan and some screws. And very basic packaging. Alright, and last but certainly not least, we have the industrial PPC Noctua NF-A14. This is the 3000 RPM version, so we're going to be seeing how it kind of compares to the original one there over there. Packaging is very reminiscent of the Redux over there. IP52 rating. I'm not sure what the standard meets, but I think that's a dust requirement. I'm not sure if that's a waterproof requirement. The RPM, airflow, all those fun statistics. So there it is on the inside. We opened it up, and the packaging is very much reminiscent of the Redux, 100%. It doesn't have all those nice extras that come with the regular fan. It just is the fan and a cable, very much more like the Redux. All that said, if you actually really need those extras, the cables and stuff like that, I'd actually recommend getting the regular fan over the what was it, PPC version, the industrials. But the industrials do have a very significant use case. So let's get into the fans and take closely about it. So these were selected because they are Noctua's 140 millimeter fans that use regular mounting. They have one other 140 millimeter fan. I think it's the A14. Don't quote me on that. Or A15. I think A15. These are A14s. Anyways, so that's why these ones are selected, to kind of compare against each other as in this roundup. So first one here is the Redux NF-P14, and it's a very basic fan. Now the materials around the outside and blade material feel very similar. The blade distance to the edge looks significantly more than the regular fans. You want the fan to be as close to the edge as possible to prevent any air from kind of coming out the wrong direction, and it improves actually fan efficiency. This does use the older SSO bearing, maximum RPM of 1,500. It does have this sawtooth pattern on the back, and I'm sure that they have a reason for it. Offhand, I would think it would just be there got something to do with how guiding the air past it, but overall, without actually running a simulation, I have no idea why. But it's a very basic impeller type fan, looks more pressure optimized. So next we have the A14s, and right off the bat you can tell that these two fans are basically identical other than the color scheme. They have the same little molding nub, the design on the fan blade, so it has these little ridges there, and these are there to help guide the airflow a little bit on the edges so that it comes off the blades more smoothly. They have the same sort of stepped inlet guiding the air into the fan blades. Yeah, those distances are a little bit larger than what we see here. But Noctua's newer fans even have a tighter gap than what we see here. The inside of the fan blades are completely smooth. They both feature, it's a little bit easier to see on the brown one, this golf ball, that's how I call it, pattern on the inside. I wonder if I can change my focus. There we go. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's a golf ball type pattern. It just helps with tripping the air to turbulent to improve the efficiency of air flowing into the fan. But, well, oh, I didn't say the RPM of this one. This has an RPM of 1,500. This one will go to 3,000. And we'll see how efficient each of these fans are. Oh, my focus was out. And we'll see how efficient each of these fans are. And we, as we saw in our testing. Before I get into my conclusion, I want to talk about value proposition for these fans. So the ones in this test are, right here, you have the P14s, then you have the A14 right here, and the A14 3000. So the P14 at the 6-inch mark is the best value. And I forgot to note, this was calculated by taking the numerical average. So you have the value you want to compare against, so my average fan, minus the fan of choice, so pick one of the fans, and then divide it by my average fan. So again, these values are going to change over time as I test more fans. And then all that was divided by the dollar value. So that way I could get negatives and positives to exaggerate, to make it more obvious which fans are particularly bad. So with that said, this is at noise normalized testing, the P14s is by far one of the best fans because it's around $15. It might be less than that. Next, at that 6-inch mark, when you compare against 100% PWM, well, the A14 3000 is the best because it can just move the most air for the least amount of money. The A14 regular is significantly worse because it's more expensive than the P14 and moves a fairly similar amount of air. But the P14 it's still okay, it's still positive. Once we're looking at the 9-inch distance mark, I wanted to look at this because this is where it tends to separate even more of the fans, as it has more room for the air to spread out. Our first one here is noise normalized again. So we have the 3000 RPM A14 is actually the best value proposition here, with the A14 being next and then the P14 following that. But all the 140s do fairly well, with the 120s kind of trailing behind. Once we're looking at 100% PWM for the same thing, the 3000 RPM fan is by far the best value, with the Silamings 4 Pro 140 being kind of like the next best. The P14s actually drops negative in this category when you're looking at 100% PWM, but I can't imagine why you'd be wanting to run your fans at 100% airspeed, at least all the time. All right, the next graph here is the value proposition through a cooler. So this is taking my air cooler into account. The best fan here for the value, noise normalized, is the P14s Redux. The A14 3000 comes in more or less next. Then when we're looking at 100% airspeed, the 3000 RPM fan does the best. That doesn't mean it will actually perform the best. And I want to note this again. There comes a point where you're moving so much air through the air cooler where you'll get no more cooling because there isn't enough heat to pull out of it. So the fact that it can spin at 3000 RPM may not matter. So I almost even wouldn't recommend the 3000 RPM fan. I'd get the 2000 RPM fan, which would reduce its value proposition because it wouldn't be spinning as fast and it costs the same amount. Okay, with all of that said, let's move on to the next graph. Next up, we have the CFM performance. That's cubic feet per minute versus noise normalized. So which fan does the best? Well, the one that is no longer for sale, the Cougar CF V12HP, but we're going to ignore it. And the fans that we are looking at, so the P14s Redux has the best value proposition. The A14 is a little bit negative here. But again, in CFM testing, it's like lab testing as opposed to real world testing, even though I don't have a real lab. Anyways, keeping jokes aside, the A14 3000 comes in a little bit behind it, but still pretty good overall. And the last graph being CFM at 100% PWM. In these graphs, I still don't think 140s and 120s can be directly compared because the CFM values are calculated differently because of different testing apparatuses. But the 3000 RPM A14 is, again, the best value because it can move the most air. With the P14s actually coming in pretty good compared to other 140mm fans. All right, let's go to my conclusion and we'll wrap this up. Conclusion time for the NF-A14, the A14 3000, and the P14. So overall, I would recommend the A14 2000 and 3000. This is the 3000 version, but the 2000 version and this have basically the same minimum RPM, and they were top performers in a cooler, with the P14 being very good as well. In case airflow, the A14 was again at the very, very top, both at noise normalized and at 100% fan speed, but you shouldn't need to run your fans and case fans at 3000 RPM. So kind of why I'd recommend more like the 2000 RPM one, because it's kind of unnecessary and you can save a couple bucks. As a note here, the regular A14 was near the top, with the P14 still very good compared to most 120mm fans. In pure CFM, cubic feet per minute airflow, the A14, 2,000, 3,000 RPM fans were at the top. Then we have the P14, which was very good over most of the 120 millimeter fans. It was also very good compared to all the 140 millimeter fans. When we're looking at 100% PWM speeds, the 3000 RPM A14 just leaves everything behind. It's just no contest. So if you have a specific use case that you need to push a lot of air, this fan cannot be beat. But otherwise, the P14 really is a best of kind of everything. The P14 was particularly good at noise performance, so I really recommend that if you're looking for a more silence-focused build. The value proposition, so the amount of air versus my average fan per dollar. So the P14 noise normalized is one of the best values. It just is good in pretty much every category when you're looking at its value proposition. The A14 is pretty good overall, as well as the 3000 RPM one. Both these are pretty good in terms of value. There are a couple categories where they don't rank as well, but any of these three would be good in that sort of way. So in conclusion, which one would I actually buy? If I need to fill out a case and get some case fans, 100% the P14. Especially if you have some of the extra rubber dampers. Otherwise, buy a pack of, I think they come in a pack of 8 for $8. So that's like $1 per. And you only need on one side, so that works out great. For a CPU cooler or a radiator, unless you're doing something crazy, the regular one is fine, but kind of whichever one you need. So if you need Y splitters and extra cable lengths, get the regular one. That should be more than sufficient. If you have all that stuff and you just need a fan, get a 2 or 3000 RPM version. Anyways, that wraps up my conclusion, and I wanted to thank you all for watching my video on computer tech and more. I'm going to be checking out more fans in the future and have my own personal list, but if you have any particular fans you want me to take a look at, please go ahead and leave them in the, write out their name in the link in the video description below, and I'll try to get my hands on it to take a look. Anyways, thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.